At the beginning of human history, distance is not a number. It is a strain in the legs, a dryness in the throat, a change in the smell of the air, and the slow shift of light across the sky. Distance is the amount of ground that can be crossed between sunrise and night, the amount of effort that can be carried in muscles before food and water must be found again. In such a world, the limits of travel are the limits of the body. A person learns the radius of a life by repetition. A valley can be crossed and returned from. A river can be followed for a day. A ridge can be climbed and descended. Beyond these ranges lie places spoken about, but not regularly visited. In early communities, movement is usually local, even when it is frequent. People walk to hunt, to gather to fish, to find water, to check traps, to visit neighboring groups. These movements create familiar paths. A path is knowledge, and knowledge reduces distance. What is known is not only where something is, but how long it takes to reach it, and what must be carried to survive the journey. The measure of distance is therefore time and risk. A place that is 2 hours away is a place that can be reached and returned from before dark. A place that is 2 days away requires planning, shelter, and luck. A place that is 10 days away begins to feel like another world, not because it is far in kilometers, but because the journey itself becomes a life event. Seasons shape this early sense of distance. In many regions, the year is divided into periods when travel is easier and periods when it is dangerous. In wet seasons, rivers swell and paths turn to mud. In cold seasons, snow and ice change the landscape. In hot seasons, water becomes scarce. The same physical distance can therefore become longer or shorter depending on when it is attempted. Travel time is not stable. It is experienced. This makes the idea of distance as an abstract, constant quantity hard to form. Distance is always tied to conditions. The earliest tools of travel are simple footwear packs, walk-in sticks, knowledge of edible plants, methods for making fire. These tools expand the range of the body, but they do not break the fundamental limit. A person still must sleep. A person still must drink. The body still heals slowly. Injury still ends journeys. In this setting, the idea of a distance that is greater than a human lifetime does not arise as a category because distance is not yet thought of in a way that invites that comparison. The farthest imaginable places are those that exist within stories beyond mountains and seas, but stories do not require arrival. They exist as boundaries of the known world, not as measured endpoints. Even when migration occurs, it often occurs as a series of steps rather than as a single grand passage. A group moves to follow herds to find new grazing land, to respond to drought, to avoid conflict, to seek better hunting. Each move may be only a few days or weeks of travel followed by a long period of living. Over years, such steps can cover great distances, but no one experiences the full distance as a single journey. The movement is distributed across time and across life. This is an early form of distance that exceeds one person's direct experience, but it is not yet understood as such. It is simply life unfolding across a changing landscape. The measure of distance in these conditions often becomes embodied in the environment. People name landmarks and use them as anchors. A certain bend in a river, a particular rock formation, a stand of trees, a mountain silhouette. These anchors create a mental map, but the map is not drawn. It is carried in memory. The map's units are not kilometers. They are the intervals between landmarks, the time between water sources, the length of a climb, the danger of a pass. A mental map can extend farther than a person has traveled because it can include information gathered from others. Yet the reality of distance remains local because the most reliable knowledge is what has been walked. In such societies, distance becomes shared through storytelling in a practical sense. People describe how to reach a place, what to expect, what resources exist along the way, and what dangers might be present. This is not the same as imagining unreachable distances. It is a social technology that extends the reach of individuals. If someone else has walked to a distant valley, that valley becomes part of the community's known world, even for those who have not gone there. The knowledge of distance begins to separate from the individual body. It becomes collective. This separation is a necessary condition for later ideas of distance exceeding a human lifetime. A single person's legs no longer define what is known. The group's memory begins to define it. Yet in the earliest stage, the group's memory still operates within a world that feels bounded by the practical reach of walking and the visible horizon. The horizon is an outer limit of perception. A person can climb a hill and see farther, but still only to the next range. Beyond that, the world is hidden. The hidden world can be imagined, but it cannot be measured. Without measurement, the comparison to a human lifetime remains vague. A journey might be said to be long, but long is not counted. It is felt. The first step toward distance becoming greater than a lifetime is therefore not an increase in physical distance traveled. It is an increase in the ability to hold distance in mind as something stable and countable. That ability begins with timekeeping. When days are counted and seasons are marked, journeys can be compared. When a community can say that a route takes a certain number of days, distance begins to become a quantity. Even then, the number of days remains variable with weather and fatigue, but the habit of counting creates a new relationship with distance. A route can be described in units that are independent of any one person's memory. It can be taught. It can be planned. The next step is the development of regular long-distance movement through trade and exchange, because repeated routes create standardized travel times and standardized knowledge of waypoints. When a route is traveled often enough, its time becomes more predictable. Predictability creates a sense of stable distance. Once stable distance exists, the mind can begin to imagine a distance that cannot be crossed within the span of a life, because life itself can be measured in years, and because travel time can be measured in days and months. In the earliest stage, these measures are still weak, and so the concept remains dormant. This section holds distance in its simplest form, distance as walking time. It is the outermost layer of the topic, because it is the foundation on which all later scale rests. Only when distance becomes a thing that can be counted, recorded, and transferred beyond the body does it begin to expand beyond what a single life can cover. The next inward step is the horizon and the known world, where seas, deserts, and mountain ranges begin to create separations that are not only felt, but recognized as boundaries, making distance something that can exceed a person's direct experience, even within a lifetime. When distance is first experienced as walking time, the world is shaped by what can be reached and returned from. The next change comes when people encounter boundaries that cannot be crossed, casually wide seas, long deserts, dense forests, mountain ranges, and hostile stretches with scarce water. These features do not only slow travel, they define edges of the known world. A person can stand at the shoreline and see no land beyond the horizon. A person can look across a desert plain where the next water source is unknown. A person can climb a ridge and see a new valley that looks close yet is separated by cliffs and snow. In these encounters, distance becomes something more than effort. It becomes separation. The horizon is the simplest form of this separation. It is a limit created by Earth's curvature and by the height of the observer. A person cannot see beyond it, no matter how sharp the eyes are. This invisibility makes the world feel finite in practice. Beyond the horizon lies uncertainty. The horizon can be pushed back by climbing a hill or by sailing outward, but it always recedes. The receding horizon teaches a subtle lesson: the world may be larger than the visible world. Yet without maps and measurement, the size remains unknowable. The horizon is therefore a boundary that invites imagination and caution. It creates a category of places that exist beyond sight, reachable only by committing to travel without certainty. Coastlines intensify this experience. For coastal peoples, the sea is both a resource and a barrier. It provides food and a route along the shore, but it also presents a flat expanse where landmarks disappear quickly. A small boat can remain near the coast, using land as reference. But the open sea removes reference points. The sky becomes the map, and a voyage becomes a commitment. Even when early seafaring develops, it often stays within sight of land, or within island chains, where the next land can be reached with careful timing. The sea, therefore, creates a structured sense of distance. Some distances are safe and familiar. Others are uncertain and dangerous. This uncertainty can make a place feel farther than it is in kilometers because the cost of error is high. Deserts create a similar effect in a different form. A desert may be crossed, but only with knowledge of water timing and route. Travel is constrained by the need to carry water or to find it. The margin for error is thin. This makes certain deserts into boundaries that separate regions almost as effectively as oceans. People living near deserts often develop routes that follow oases, river valleys, or seasonal paths. These routes become lifelines. They also become the first long corridors that connect distant regions in a predictable way. Yet the existence of the route does not eliminate the boundary. It concentrates travel into narrow channels. Distance becomes a question of whether one has access to the channel and the knowledge to use it. Mountain ranges create boundaries through altitude, cold, and terrain. A mountain pass can be the only link between valleys. When snow closes, the pass distance increases dramatically because the route becomes impossible. A place that is a week away in summer can be unreachable in winter. This seasonal closure makes distance variable in a way that is sharply discontinuous. It is not only slower, it is blocked. The experience of blocked distance teaches that separation can be permanent for long stretches of time, longer than a season, perhaps longer than a lifetime, if a route is never known. These boundaries reshape the idea of the known world. The known world is not defined only by how far one can walk. It is defined by networks of safe routes that cross or avoid boundaries. A community's known world includes the places it can reach reliably, the places it can reach with risk, and the places it hears about but cannot reach at all. The third category is crucial. It introduces the idea of distance that exists as information rather than experience. A distant land can be part of the known world in the form of stories, rumors, and traded objects, even if no one in the community has been there. This is an early form of distance exceeding direct human reach. The body does not travel, but the effects of travel arrive. Traded objects are especially important. When a material appears that does not exist locally, it implies a source beyond the local region. A shell from a distant coast found inland, a stone tool made from a particular kind of rock, found far from its quarry, pigments or metals that require special sources. Each object is evidence of a path. The object compresses distance into something that can be held. It carries a silent message that the world is connected by travel beyond the horizon. In this sense, distance becomes a property of networks, not only of legs. A person may never cross a desert, yet may live with materials that have crossed it. The growth of such networks also changes time perception. If goods move along chains of exchange, the time from source to destination can be long, perhaps months or years. Yet the movement is not a single journey. It is a sequence of transfers. Each segment is within the reach of a traveler's life, but the whole chain can span a distance that no one person ever crosses end to end. This is another early way distance begins to exceed individual experience. It is distance distributed across many people. The concept that one person could traverse the entire chain may not even arise at first, because travel is tied to social roles and local knowledge. Yet the chain exists. The world is larger than the individual's travel radius, and it becomes larger in a way that is structured and repeated. The horizon also becomes more intelligible through navigation. When sailors use stars to hold course, when desert travelers use sun position and landmarks, when mountain travelers learn passes, and seasonal signs, distance becomes something that can be managed. Management creates confidence. Confidence increases ambition. Over time, routes extend farther. The known world grows. Yet even as routes extend, the experience of boundaries remains. The sea can still swallow ships. The desert can still kill. Mountains can still isolate. The known world expands, but it does so as a patchwork of connected regions, separated by hard barriers. It is within this patchwork that distance first begins to approach and then exceed the span of a human life in a meaningful way. A person might be born in one valley and die without leaving it, while hearing of far coasts and cities. Another person might travel widely, but still never reach the farthest parts of the network. Even if a heroic traveler crosses many regions, the world continues beyond. The key is not that travel becomes impossible. It is that the world's extent becomes recognized as larger than any one person's experience. This recognition can be quiet. It can appear as a simple humility about the unknown. It can appear as the acceptance that there are always lands beyond. The horizon becomes a symbol of this, but more importantly, it becomes a practical fact. There is always more land and water beyond what a lifetime can cover. The act of mapping begins to change how the horizon is treated. Early maps may be symbolic and local, But even symbolic maps externalize distance. They allow a person to hold a representation of a region beyond immediate view. As mapping improves, it becomes possible to relate different regions in a single picture. Even without accurate scale, the map suggests that the world is a connected whole. This again pushes against the idea that a person's local world is the entire world. Yet at this stage, the concept of distance greater than a lifetime is still not a formal idea. It is a growing awareness that the world's edges are not reachable by casual travel. This section holds the horizon and the physical barriers as the main new element. Distance becomes separation because some boundaries remove landmarks and safety. The next inward step is the rise of journeys longer than seasons through trade routes and migrations that span years. When time is measured in years and travel becomes planned across that scale, the idea of distance exceeding a life begins to form more clearly because travel time begins to compete with the length of a human life, rather than only with the length of a day or a season. When boundaries like seas, deserts, and mountains define the edges of the known world, distance begins to feel larger than daily effort. The next shift happens when movement becomes organized across longer timescales, so that journeys are planned not to return within days or weeks, but to last across seasons and sometimes across years. Trade routes, long migrations, and multi-stage caravans introduce a different relationship with distance. Distance is no longer only about surviving until nightfall or until the next water source. It becomes a question of sustaining a project. Food must be stored, animals must be managed, routes must be learned, and risks must be accepted for long spans. In this setting, time begins to rival distance as the main cost and travel begins to push against the boundaries of a human life. Long-distance trade creates repeated journeys that link far regions. A caravan route across a desert or a steppe may take months. A sea voyage following winds and currents may take weeks to months with long waits for favorable conditions. Overland travel through multiple kingdoms or ecological zones may require wintering at intermediate points. These journeys produce a new kind of traveler, someone whose life includes long intervals away from home and whose identity is tied to routes rather than to a single place. Such travelers carry not only goods, but information. They return with stories, with knowledge of markets, with maps in memory, and with a sense that the world extends far beyond any one region. For the communities connected by these routes, distance becomes a predictable interval. A certain spice or metal arrives after a known seasonal pattern. A messenger can be expected after a certain number of moons. A ship arrives when the winds shift. Predictability turns distance into a schedule. A schedule, in turn, allows planning. Planning is the moment when distance begins to take on a stable form independent of the individual traveler. Even if a particular person dies on the route remains. Others will take it. The journey becomes part of a system. Yet these long journeys also reveal how easily a human life can be consumed by distance. A merchant might spend years traveling and trading, seeing home only intermittently. A sailor might vanish at sea, leaving no record. A caravan might be lost to drought or conflict. When the cost is high, the journey begins to feel like a life event rather than a task. This is a subtle boundary once a journey becomes a life event, it begins to compete with the time of a life. A person might undertake it once, perhaps twice, and be changed by it. The idea of crossing farther than the known routes begins to feel less like an extension and more like a different category. Migration adds another layer. Some migrations are seasonal, returning each year. Others are relocations prompted by climate shifts, resource depletion, conflict, or opportunity. A relocation can unfold across years. A group may move slowly, settling temporarily, moving again, adapting to new regions. Children may grow up along the path. Elders may die before the end. In such movements, distance is not a line between 2 points. It is a corridor of life. The group's final destination may be uncertain for a long time. The journey becomes the place. This is one of the earliest experiences in which distance and time become intertwined in a way that can exceed a single human life. The route continues, but the individuals change. These multi-year movements also require new methods of memory. A route that spans thousands of kilometers cannot be held in the mind only as a sequence of familiar local landmarks. It must be broken into segments, each with its own waypoints and hazards. Knowledge becomes modular. One segment is known by one group, another by another. Information is exchanged at meeting points. This modularity makes distance distributable. No one person needs to know the entire route. The route exists as a shared structure. This is an important step toward distance exceeding a lifetime because it allows routes to persist beyond individual lives and to extend beyond what any one person can traverse. The growth of settlements and cities intensifies this process. Cities become hubs where goods from many places gather. A person in a city might encounter materials from far beyond the horizon: woods from distant forests, stones from distant quarries, foods from distant climates. The city becomes a concentrated representation of distance. It makes the far present. Yet the far remains far in travel time. The city, therefore, creates a new mental contrast. An object can travel across months and still be present in daily life, while a person might never travel to its source. This contrast teaches that the world is connected yet too large for individual experience. With these connections, the concept of a world map begins to emerge even before accurate maps exist. People may not know the precise shape of coasts and continents, but they begin to understand that land extends beyond land, that seas connect to seas, that there are multiple climate zones, that mountains give way to plains, that deserts lie between fertile regions. The world becomes layered in space, and it becomes layered in time through travel. Travel time becomes an expected feature of distance, not an accident. A person begins to understand that some places are not one journey away, but many. The world is no longer a circle around home. It is a network of routes that may take years to traverse. The moment distance begins to exceed a human lifetime is not yet fully here, because even multi-year journeys can still be completed within a life for those who devote themselves to travel. Yet the foundations of the concept are forming. When a journey takes months or years, it becomes clear that some distances, if they are larger by a certain factor, would take longer than a person's life. The multiplication is simple. If crossing a known world takes years, then crossing a world several times larger would take decades. If crossing a continent takes months, then crossing multiple continents might take years. Once this scaling logic becomes part of thought, distance can begin to be compared to lifespan. The question becomes thinkable: how far could someone go before they die? Timekeeping becomes crucial. When societies count years, keep calendars, and record durations, they can compare travel time to lifespan more explicitly. Lifespan itself may not be precisely measured, but a rough sense exists. A person lives through a certain number of seasons, raises children, sees grandchildren, if lucky. When travel time begins to be described in years rather than in days, it enters the same unit as life stages. A journey that takes 10 years is no longer just long. It is a major fraction of a life. A journey that might take 50 years begins to feel like something no one could complete. This is the dawn of the idea that distance can be greater than a human lifetime. The social consequences follow. Long routes require trust, networks, protection agreements, and shared norms for exchange. They also require relay systems. Messages can be carried by successive travelers, reducing the time for information, compared with a single traveler making the entire trip. Relay is an early method of compressing the effects of distance without compressing the distance itself. It is a way of making a long journey possible as a collective act, even if no one person can carry it alone. Relay thinking is another foundation for later concepts of distance exceeding a lifetime, because it accepts that tasks can outlast individuals and still be completed by communities. This section holds the transition from seasonal travel to multi-year routes as the main inward move. Distance becomes something that can consume years and years, begin to be compared to life. The next inward step is the explicit emergence of generational paths, where routes and projects persist across generations, and where knowledge of distant places is maintained, even when the journey itself cannot be completed by any single person. This is where distance begins to be recognized not only as large, but as larger than a human lifetime, in a practical and social sense. When journeys begin to last across seasons and years, distance starts to compete with the span of a human life. The next step is the recognition that some routes and projects are not only long, but generational. They are begun by one group and continued by another. They are known through inheritance of knowledge rather than through direct memory. In this stage, distance becomes greater than a human lifetime, not only as a physical fact, but as a social arrangement. A path can outlast the people who walk it. A destination can be known without being reached by the same person who first sets out. This is a quiet turning in human history, because it changes the relationship between individual experience and the world's extent. Generational distance emerges first in the simplest form, the continuation of routes. A trade route that spans desert seas or mountain chains may be traveled by many individuals, each completing segments or repeating the same journey year after year, but the route itself becomes older than any traveler. A person might join a caravan as a young adult, learn the waypoints and hazards, and then teach those to younger travelers later. Over time, the route becomes a tradition. It is maintained by knowledge passed down and by repeated practice. In such a system, the route exists as a cultural object. The distance it spans is not something one person invents anew. It is inherited. This inheritance changes how distance is imagined. In a purely local world, distance is what one has personally walked. In a route-based world, distance includes places one has never seen but believes in because the route has existed for generations. Trust shifts from individual sight to collective continuity. This shift makes it possible to hold much larger distances in mind. It also makes it possible to plan ventures that no single person could fully oversee. Once a society can maintain long routes across generations, it can also maintain projects across generations. Monument building is an early example of generational projects. Large structures can require years or decades to complete. A person can begin work on a temple, a wall, or an irrigation canal and die before it is finished. The project continues because it is carried by a community and by institutions. This is not distance in kilometers, but it is distance in time. And it teaches a crucial lesson: human effort can be distributed across lives. Once time can be distributed across lives, distance can as well, because distance is often experienced through time. A journey that would take longer than one life can be imagined as a sequence of stages carried by successive travelers or successive crews. The mind begins to accept that the individual is not the unit of completion. The community is. Migration can also become generational when it occurs not as a single relocation, but as a long drift over centuries. A people may gradually expand into new territory as population grows or as climate shifts. The movement may be so slow that no person experiences it as a migration. Yet over generations, the group's homeland changes. The distance covered can be enormous, but it is not covered by a single expedition. It is covered by a slow wave of settlement. In such cases, distance greater than a lifetime exists, in the simplest biological form, the movement of a lineage. The individual lives and dies within a local place, but the lineage travels. The knowledge that supports generational distance often takes the form of stories, but these stories become practical. They include directions, warnings, descriptions of water sources, and descriptions of safe seasons. They can be encoded in myths, but they carry usable information. The story becomes a container for root knowledge. Because stories can be repeated without writing, they can persist across many generations. This is one reason early root knowledge can span distances far beyond what a single person could verify. The reliability is not perfect, but the persistence is powerful. It creates a memory longer than a life. Writing intensifies this effect. When writing becomes common enough to record routes, distances, and schedules, knowledge becomes less dependent on oral transmission. Written records can preserve details beyond the lifespan of the writer. They can also be copied and spread. A route described in a text can be learned by someone who never met the original traveler. This is a major change in how distance is held. Distance becomes abstracted. It can be stored, transmitted, and consulted. A map or itinerary can outlive its maker. This again strengthens the idea that the world's extent is not limited by individual experience. Generational distance also appears in governance and empire. As states expand, they attempt to administer regions far from the center. The time for messages to travel becomes a key constraint. If a message takes weeks or months to reach a distant province, then decision-making becomes slow. The state may develop courier systems, relay stations, roads, and ships to manage this. The building of such systems is itself a generational project, and the maintenance of them requires continuity. In such an environment, distance is not only a physical separation, it is a delay. Delay begins to be treated as an important feature of distance. This prepares the mind for later ideas of unreachable distance, where delay becomes so large that interaction becomes effectively impossible within a life. Another expression of generational distance is exploration by proxy. A community can send out travelers and then incorporate their reports into collective knowledge. If one traveler returns after years with information about a far coast, that coast becomes part of the community's mental world for decades, even if few others ever go there. If another traveler later extends that knowledge farther, the world expands again. Over time, the known world can grow through successive expeditions, each building on the last. The full distance from the original homeland to the new farthest known point may become something that no single person has traveled, because each expedition begins from a new baseline. Knowledge leaps forward in stages outlasting individual bodies. At the level of personal experience, this creates a new kind of humility about travel. A person may accept that there are places they will never see, not because those places are mythical, but because travel time and risk make it unlikely. Yet they may also accept that their children or grandchildren might see them. Distance becomes a generational horizon. This is a key emotional change in the history of distance. It is not despair. It is a calm recognition of scale. A person can contribute to a longer project by teaching building infrastructure or preserving knowledge. They can participate in the expansion of the known world without reaching its edges. In this stage, the phrase "greater than a human lifetime" begins to make sense as a practical category. A route might take longer than a person can afford to devote. A project might take longer than a person can live. A message might take so long that the sender and receiver might not both be alive at the time of response, especially if the exchange requires multiple cycles. This last point is subtle. Once communication delay becomes long, it begins to mirror the later problem of cosmic distances, where a signal might take years, decades, or longer. The idea that communication itself can be slower than life is one of the earliest forms of distance exceeding a lifetime. It does not require a journey. It requires only delay. Generational distance, therefore, marks a transition from distance as personal challenge to distance as structural fact. The world becomes something that cannot be personally exhausted. It can only be sampled. The individual life becomes a segment within a larger continuity. This is not only a social transformation, it is also a cognitive transformation. The mind learns to accept that some things are known through records and through inherited knowledge, not through direct observation. Once that acceptance exists, the stage is set for distance to grow beyond Earth scale and into sky scale, because sky distances will never be walked. They will only be inferred, recorded, and passed down. This section holds generational paths, as the moment distance becomes greater than a lifetime in a social sense. The next inward step is mapping without travel, where representation becomes more powerful than experience. When maps and models describe regions most people will never visit, distance becomes a property of the world itself, rather than of the traveler. This creates a further separation between knowledge and presence, preparing the mind for the later acceptance of cosmic distances, where the only possible relationship is measurement and inference. When roots and projects become generational distance, is no longer limited by what a single person can experience. The next change is the rise of representation. A place can be known through a map, an itinerary, a written description, or a list of travel days, even when most people never go there. In this stage, distance becomes an object of thought. It can be drawn, compared, and stored. The world becomes larger not because bodies move farther, but because minds can hold larger structures. The separation between distance and experience widens, and with it, the possibility that distance can exceed a lifetime becomes more stable and more widely shared. Early maps do not always aim for accurate scale. Many are symbolic, showing relationships and importance rather than precise distances. Yet even symbolic maps perform a crucial function. They place multiple regions in one frame. They suggest that different places coexist in one continuous world. A river connects to another river. A coast wraps around a sea. A road passes through a mountain pass. Once such connections are drawn, distance becomes something that can be contemplated in its entirety. A person can see, at least in concept, that there is more land than they will ever walk. The map makes the world bigger than the body. As mapping techniques improve, scale becomes more reliable. Coastlines are compared across voyages. Latitudes are estimated from the sky. Distances along routes are recorded in travel days and later in more standardized units. Over time, maps begin to include proportions that are close enough to reality to allow planning. Planning from a map is different from planning from memory. A map allows someone to think about routes they have never taken. It allows someone to imagine alternative paths. It allows someone to combine information from multiple sources into a single coherent image. This coherence matters because it creates the sense that the world has a measurable extent. Once extent is measurable, it can be compared to lifespan. The most important effect of mapping without travel is that it makes distance impersonal. Distance becomes a property of the world rather than a property of the traveler. A person no longer says only "it is far for me." They can begin to say it is far in itself. This sounds simple, but it is a major shift. When distance is impersonal, it becomes stable across generations. A route remains long even when new travelers take it. A sea crossing remains long even when ships improve, though the time can shorten. The map becomes a reference that outlasts individuals. This reference changes social expectations. In a world without broad maps, many people might assume that the world ends not far beyond their horizon. With maps, people can see that the world extends far beyond. Even if they never travel, they can know that distant regions exist. This knowledge is not always accurate in detail, but it is expansive in structure. It encourages the idea that there are many places a person cannot visit in one life. The idea becomes normal. Mapping also supports administration and commerce, further strengthening representation over experience. A ruler can plan roads, taxation, and logistics across regions they never personally visit. A merchant can plan trade strategies based on distances and routes learned from records. A military commander can plan campaigns using maps rather than relying only on scouts. In each case, the decision-maker's influence extends farther than their travel. This extension makes distance feel manageable in one sense because it can be acted upon through systems, but it also makes distance feel larger because it is now visible as a structure too large to be personally traversed. A related form of representation is the written travel account. When a traveler describes a far region, the description allows others to imagine that region. If the account includes travel time landmarks and hazards, it can function almost like a map. Over time, collections of such accounts accumulate. The world becomes known through compiled voices. The compilation can contain contradictions and errors, but it also creates a sense of breadth. A reader can learn of deserts, coasts, and cities beyond any personal reach. The reader can accept that the world is larger than any one life, because the reader's mind can travel faster than the reader's body. The mental journey takes hours. The physical journey would take years or might be impossible. This contrast is one of the deepest ways representation changes the meaning of distance. Navigation also becomes more abstract. When sailors learn to use stars and instruments to hold course, they begin to think of position as a set of coordinates. Coordinates are another form of representation. They describe a place without describing the journey. A coordinate is a way of saying where without saying how. Once a place can be specified by coordinate, the place becomes part of a grid that can extend indefinitely. This grid supports the idea of an open world that can be mapped and subdivided. It also supports the idea that distance is a difference between coordinates, a quantity that can be computed. Computation makes distance feel objective. As distance becomes computable, the idea of an edge changes. An edge is no longer only the point where knowledge stops. It is also the point where mapping stops. When a coastline is traced, the map's edge moves. The world becomes something that can be progressively filled in. Yet this filling in reveals another truth. Even if the Earth is finite, it is large enough that completing its map is a major project. It may take centuries of voyages, surveys, and corrections. The map itself becomes generational. People begin a mapping effort and die before it is complete. The project persists. The completion of the map becomes a communal achievement rather than a personal one. In this way, mapping without travel not only represents distance, it enacts distance as a time-consuming task. It reinforces the idea that the world's full extent cannot be personally covered. Representation also changes how people interpret absence. When there is a blank region on a map, it does not necessarily mean nothing exists there. It means the information is missing. This distinction between nothing and unknown becomes important. It teaches that the limits of knowledge are not the limits of reality. The world can be larger than the known world. This again supports the idea of distance exceeding a lifetime, because unknown regions can lie beyond the reach of current routes and current travelers. Discovering them may require long-term efforts that outlast individuals. The act of measuring distance on maps also begins to separate distance from hardship. A sea crossing may be dangerous, but on a map, it becomes a line segment. A mountain range may be lethal, but on a map, it becomes a ridge symbol. This abstraction can make distance appear simple even when it is not. Yet the abstraction also allows comparison. A person can see that one route is longer than another regardless of difficulty. Comparison encourages the idea that some routes are too long to attempt. Once the world is visible as a set of routes, it becomes possible to say that a route would take too long for a human life. The statement becomes grounded in representation rather than in vague feeling. The broader effect is that knowledge no longer requires arrival. A person can have a mental possession of the world through maps and texts, even when they never travel far. This is a powerful change in human history because it decouples understanding from physical presence. It also prepares the mind for later eras when the most distant things will never be visited. The habit of knowing through representation becomes essential. Without it, cosmic distances would be psychologically inaccessible. This section holds mapping without travel as the central mechanism by which distance becomes an abstract, stable quantity. The next inward step is to shift from Earth to the sky, because the sky is where distance becomes not only greater than a lifetime, but greater than any conceivable journey by ordinary means. When the stars are treated as objects at immense distances, the comparison between distance and lifespan becomes dramatic and unavoidable. The sky introduces separations that cannot be bridged by any route system or map in the old sense, forcing a deeper change in what it means to know a place at all. Once maps and records allow distance to be held without travel, the mind is prepared for a larger step, the recognition that some distances cannot be crossed by any ordinary journey at all. The sky becomes the first and most persistent example of this. For most of human history, the stars and planets are visible nightly, familiar in pattern, and yet unreachable in practice. They present a paradox. They are part of everyday experience, yet they are farther than anything the body can approach. In this stage, distance becomes greater than a human lifetime in a new way, not through the size of Earth, but through the existence of places that remain forever out of reach of the body, reachable only by sight and by inference. In early sky views, the heavens can still be imagined as a dome or a set of layers, but even in those images, the stars remain inaccessible. A bird can rise higher than a human. A mountain can bring a person closer to the clouds, but the stars do not become larger or nearer. No matter how far one travels across Earth, the stars remain fixed in their patterns and their brightness. This stability suggests immense distance long before distance is measured. It creates an intuitive sense that the sky is not a nearby roof. It is something else far beyond the local world. This intuition is one of the earliest experiences of distance that exceeds not only a lifetime, but any conceivable walking journey. The moon complicates this intuitive picture because it changes visibly. It shows phases. It moves quickly against the stars. It sometimes covers stars. It undergoes eclipses. These behaviors suggest that the moon is closer than the stars. In this way, the sky begins to sort itself into near and far. The near objects like the moon and the planets behave differently from the far star background. Yet even the near objects remain unreachable. The moon's phases may suggest a sphere lit by the sun, but the journey to it remains unimaginable without technology. The planets wander, but they do not approach. They do not become places one can plan to visit. The sky is therefore the first arena where distance is experienced as absolute separation rather than as a scaled-up version of travel. The development of astronomy gradually turns this intuitive separation into a structured one. When observers measure the Earth's size and use geometry to estimate the moon's distance, the sky gains a numerical depth. Even if early numbers are imprecise, the scale is clear enough to shock human scale intuition. The moon is not a few mountain heights away. It is vastly farther. A person might cross a continent in months or years, but the moon's distance suggests a journey that would take far longer by any known means. The comparison to a human lifetime begins to take form because a human lifetime is one of the few stable time scales available for comparison. The moon becomes a distance that can be stated and therefore compared. The stars deepen this effect. Attempts to detect stellar parallax show that if Earth moves around the Sun, nearby stars should shift slightly against distant stars across the year. The failure to detect such shifts with early instruments implies that stars are extremely far away. Even without precise distances, the conclusion is that the star sphere, if it exists, must be enormous, or that stars are scattered through vast space. Either way, the scale becomes beyond ordinary comprehension. The sky becomes a realm where distance is not just large but inhuman. It is not a place for travel. It is a place for measurement. This is a key psychological change. On Earth, a place is known by reaching it. In the sky, a place is known without reaching it. The mind learns to accept knowledge at a distance. A star's position can be catalogued. Its brightness can be compared. Its color can be noticed. A planet's path can be predicted. These forms of knowledge do not require arrival. They require observation and record. The sky, therefore, trains humans in an epistemology of distance, a way of knowing that does not depend on the body. This becomes increasingly important as sky scale becomes better measured, because the measured distances quickly outgrow any plausible journey time. The sky also changes the meaning of the word lifetime. On Earth, a lifetime is long enough to cross many regions if one devotes oneself to travel. It is long enough to sail oceans, cross deserts, and learn routes. In the sky, a lifetime is not long enough, even in principle, given the speeds available to ancient travel. Even if a person could travel without needing food and water, which is impossible, the physical means of moving through air and water cannot extend into the void above. The sky, therefore, introduces not only large distance but a barrier of medium. The air ends. Beyond it is a region where breathing and burning do not work. The separation is not just far, it is fundamentally different. This makes the concept of distance greater than a lifetime sharper. It is no longer a matter of time scaling. It is a matter of category. Yet even in this categorical separation, the sky remains present in daily life. People use stars for navigation. They use the sun for time. They use the moon for months. The unreachable distance is also intimately familiar. This combination creates a steady mental tension that runs through human history. The heavens are both near in experience and far in reach. This tension encourages imagination because humans naturally ask about what they can see. It also encourages restraint because the inability to reach encourages respect and symbolism. Many cultures place gods, ancestors, or spirits in the sky, partly because the sky is beyond human reach. The distance becomes not only physical, but social and moral. Yet the key historical point is that the sky makes distance absolute in a way Earth rarely does. As measurement improves, the sky's distances begin to exceed not only a lifetime, but the span of recorded history. Once the moon's distance is known to be enormous compared with Earth travel, and once the sun's distance is inferred to be far greater still, the scale pushes beyond what any ancient society can conceive as journey time. Even the idea of a vehicle traveling continuously for years without resupply is absent. The sky, therefore, becomes the first domain where humans accept that some places may never be reached. This acceptance is not necessarily explicit. It is implicit in how societies treat the heavens as objects of contemplation rather than of travel. This stage also introduces a quiet distinction between seeing and touching. On Earth, seeing a mountain might imply that one could someday climb it. In the sky, seeing a star does not imply one could reach it. The sky teaches that visibility is not the same as accessibility. This lesson later becomes central in the scientific age where many phenomena are visible or measurable, but not directly accessible. It is also central to the modern understanding of the universe, where light brings information across enormous distances that bodies cannot cross. The sky thus becomes the first context, where distance clearly exceeds a human lifetime in a stable way. It establishes a mental category of unreachable separation. Yet it does not yet provide the full modern idea of cosmic scale, because that requires precise measurement and a standardized language for distance. The next inward step is the development of more refined astronomical measurement, where the vastness of space is expressed in numbers that can be compared, stored, and used, and where the relationship between distance and time becomes explicit through the concept that light itself takes time to travel. When light becomes the ruler, distance becomes inseparable from time, and the comparison to a lifetime becomes both precise and unavoidable. Once the sky becomes a realm of unreachable separation, the next transformation is the arrival of measurement strong enough to give that separation a stable numeric form. The difference between a vague sense of far and a quantified sense of vast is profound. Quantification makes distance comparable. It makes distance transferable. It also makes distance capable of overwhelming a human lifetime in a way that can be stated plainly. This stage begins when astronomy develops methods for measuring the scale of the solar system, and then extends outward to measure the distances to stars. As these measurements improve, the idea that distance can exceed a lifetime becomes not merely intuitive, but explicit. The solar system is the first arena where large distances become measurable and meaningful. Once Earth's size is estimated, the Moon's distance can be approached through geometry and eclipse observations. The Sun's distance, harder to determine, is gradually constrained through improved methods. As the astronomical unit becomes defined, the spacing between planets becomes more than a diagram. It becomes a set of numbers. These numbers immediately create a new kind of comparison. Travel time can be estimated if speed is assumed. Even if the assumed speed is based on the fastest ships or the fastest projectiles, the resulting times are immense. The solar system becomes a space where ordinary travel speeds fail. This is the first clear numerical demonstration that distance can outrun a human life. Yet the solar system still sits within a scale that the human mind can with effort picture in terms of days, months, or years if fast motion is imagined. The deeper shock arrives with the stars. Measuring the distance to stars requires parallax, the apparent shift of a nearby star against more distant background stars as Earth moves around the Sun. The shift is tiny, and detecting it requires precise instruments. When parallax is finally measured for nearby stars, it reveals distances so large that they exceed solar system scale by an enormous factor. The stars are not merely beyond the planets. They are far beyond in a way that changes the meaning of far. The number of astronomical units to a nearby star is so large that it becomes cumbersome to express. This motivates new units and new language. At this point, distance begins to exceed a lifetime in a new, rigorous way. A person can imagine traveling to the moon in a fantasy, perhaps in days. They can imagine traveling to Mars in months. They can imagine traveling to the outer planets in years. But when the nearest stars are measured and found to be separated by distances that would require many thousands of years at the speeds of early spacecraft, the lifetime comparison becomes unavoidable. The distance is not merely longer than a life. It is longer than a lineage in any practical sense. The separation becomes structurally out of reach. This shift becomes even more precise when the finite speed of light becomes part of measurement culture. Light does not arrive instantly. It takes time to travel. This simple fact binds distance to time directly. If a star is observed, the light being seen is light that has traveled for years. If a galaxy is observed, the light may have traveled for millions or billions of years. The universe becomes not only vast in space, but layered in time. Distance is no longer only a number. It is a delay. A human lifetime becomes a small unit compared with many of these delays. The comparison becomes both spatial and temporal at once. The concept of a light year emerges from this relationship. A light year is not a measure of time, but a measure of distance defined by how far light travels in 1 year. This unit carries an embedded human timescale, the year, which makes the distance more comprehensible in one sense and more overwhelming in another. When a star is said to be many light years away, the phrase quietly says that even light requires many years to cross the gap. A human body traveling much slower than light would require far longer. The lifetime comparison becomes immediate. The unit itself is built out of time. It makes distance and time inseparable. At this stage, measurement begins to create a hierarchy of unreachable scales. Some distances exceed a lifetime by a small factor, perhaps by a few. Others exceed it by hundreds. Others by millions. The mind is forced to accept that the universe contains separations, not only beyond personal travel, but beyond any plausible travel at all with known means. Yet the same measurement that reveals this also provides a new kind of closeness, the closeness of knowledge. A star's distance can be measured even when it cannot be reached. Its motion can be tracked. Its properties can be inferred from its light. The universe becomes a place where understanding can outrun presence. This produces a deep change in what it means for distance to be greater than a lifetime. In earlier stages, distance greater than a lifetime implies inability to complete a journey. It implies that a traveler cannot go and return. In the astronomical stage, distance greater than a lifetime becomes normal and does not necessarily imply ignorance. A distance can be huge and yet well characterized. The mind learns that distance and knowledge are separable. This decoupling is one of the most important intellectual shifts in human history. It is the foundation of modern science, where many objects are known only through signals and measurements, not through direct contact. Measurement also forces clarity about speed. A person can imagine an arbitrary speed in a story, but measurement allows one to compute travel time for a given speed and see the result. Even if a speed is optimistic, the times can remain beyond a life. This creates a sober realism. It discourages the casual assumption that technology will simply shrink all distances. It shows that some distances are so large that even enormous improvements in speed leave them still larger than a life. The lifetime becomes a scale for evaluating feasibility. It becomes a reference point in discussions of travel communication and exploration. This stage also introduces the idea that distance can be greater than a lifetime, even for communication, not just for travel. If light takes years to travel from a nearby star, then a message sent by radio would also take years to arrive, because radio waves are a form of light. A conversation with a civilization around such a star, if it existed, would unfold over years per exchange. This is a different sense of separation. It is not just that bodies cannot cross the distance. It is that interaction itself becomes slow. Distance turns into isolation through delay. A lifetime may not be long enough for many back-and-forth exchanges. Even the simplest two-way communication becomes stretched. This introduces a new kind of loneliness in the structure of the universe. But in this narrative, the focus remains on the factual implication. Distance, once tied to light travel time, naturally exceeds human lifespans in many contexts. As measurement continues outward beyond nearby stars, the scale grows again. The Milky Way's size is estimated. Other galaxies are recognized. Their distances are measured through methods that build on the ladder of closer measurements. Each rung of this ladder extends the reach of numeric distance farther. At each rung, the distance in light years becomes larger, and the embedded time becomes larger. Human lifetimes become increasingly negligible as units. The universe becomes a place where the past is visible in the sky because light carries history. This measurement-based vastness changes how distance is felt. It can no longer be reduced to effort or endurance. It becomes a property of the universe's geometry and the finite speed of signal. The idea of distance greater than a lifetime becomes a normal feature of reality rather than a special case. It becomes something that must be accommodated in thinking about exploration, communication, and even causality, because events far away cannot influence the present instantly. This section holds the rise of astronomical measurement and the binding of distance to time as the core. Once distance is expressed through units like the light year and connected to the speed of light, the lifetime comparison becomes precise. The next inward step is to focus on how time replaces effort as the key cost of distance. When distance is viewed primarily through travel time signal delay and the long spans required for any crossing the human relationship, to distance changes again. Distance becomes not something to be conquered by strength, but something to be lived with through patience systems and the acceptance that many separations are permanent on human timescales. Once measurement binds distance to time, distance stops being primarily a question of effort. It becomes a question of duration. A journey's cost is no longer imagined mainly in exhaustion or supplies, but in the sheer length of the interval required. This shift changes how humans relate to far places. It also makes the phrase "greater than a human lifetime" become both practical and ordinary, because the comparison is now made in a shared unit time. When distance is framed as time to cross, at a given speed, the lifetime becomes an unavoidable reference, and many distances become, in a calm and straightforward way, longer than a life. In a walking world, speed varies with terrain, health weather, and load. Time is counted in days and distance is felt. In a measured world, speed can be specified and time follows. Even before modern engine societies begin to develop approximate standard speeds, how far a messenger can travel in a day, how far a ship can sail with favorable winds, how far an animal caravan can go before needing rest. These standards allow the mind to estimate travel time for long routes. Once travel time can be estimated, it can be compared to the length of a season, the length of a year, and eventually the length of a life. The lifetime comparison becomes sharper as societies develop better records of age and duration. When birth and death are recorded, and when lifespans can be described as decades rather than as vague old age, it becomes possible to speak of a human life as a span of years. This makes planning across years more coherent. It also makes it clear that even within Earth-scale travel, some projects begin to approach the lifetime boundary. A person can plan a voyage that will take years and accept that they may not return. A person can plan a settlement effort that will take decades to stabilize, accepting that they may die before it is secure. Time becomes a resource to be spent, and a life becomes the ultimate budget. The change becomes more dramatic when mechanical speed enters the picture. Engines, railways, and later automobiles and aircraft can compress some distances in a way that seems to defeat the old limits. A journey that once took months can take days. A message that once took weeks can take minutes by telegraph. This could appear to suggest that distance is being conquered. Yet the deeper lesson is more nuanced. Machines shift the boundary between reachable and unreachable, but they do not erase it. They reveal it in a clearer way. When some distances shrink, the remaining large distances stand out. When a continent can be crossed in days, the ocean becomes the next scale of comparison. When the ocean can be crossed in days, the planet becomes the next scale. When the planet can be circled quickly, the moon and planets become the next scale. Each technological compression of distance on one layer exposes a larger layer where distance still dominates. In this way, time replaces effort as the dominant factor, not because travel becomes easy, but because travel becomes fast enough in some contexts that the limiting factor is no longer the body's endurance. It is the distance itself. A train does not get tired. A ship can sail for weeks if provisioned. An aircraft can fly for hours at speeds far beyond walking. These machines suggest that if a vehicle can maintain speed, the main remaining constraint is the duration needed to cross a gap. This logic scales naturally to space. A spacecraft, like a train, does not tire. Yet the space between worlds is so large that time becomes the overriding constraint. The solar system provides a clear illustration. Once people can compute planetary distances and understand orbital motion, they can compute travel times for hypothetical vehicles. Even at speeds far beyond any sailing ship, the time to reach Mars can be months. The time to reach the outer planets can be years. The time to reach the edge of the sun's plasma environment can be decades. These times are not abstractions. They are the output of distance divided by speed. The lifetime boundary appears naturally when the result exceeds a few decades. No special drama is required. It is a straightforward comparison. The stars make the point even more strongly. Once stellar distances are measured in light years, and the speed of light is understood as finite, the minimum possible travel time for any physical object becomes meaningful. Even at the speed of light, a nearby star is years away. Any vehicle moving slower would take longer. Human lifetimes are measured in decades. Therefore, travel to other stars at known technological speeds would take many lifetimes. This is not an opinion. It is a simple relationship between distance and speed. In this framing, distance greater than a lifetime becomes not a rare case, but the norm for many astronomical separations. The same logic applies to communication. If radio waves travel at light speed, then communication across light-year distances requires years. A two-way exchange requires twice the one-way time plus time to interpret and respond. For many distances, this means a conversation would unfold over decades or centuries. This makes distance greater than a lifetime not only a barrier to travel, but a barrier to interaction. The universe becomes a place where causality itself is limited by time delays. Events far away are not happening now in any practical sense for the observer. They are arriving as old light. The observer's present includes the distant past. This temporal layering is a natural outcome of finite signal speed. It means that even observation is shaped by distance. When time becomes the dominant framing, another subtle change occurs. Patience becomes a necessary element of knowledge. A culture that expects immediate results struggles to accommodate long durations. Yet astronomical knowledge demands long durations in several ways. Parallax requires observations across months. Some stellar motions require years to measure. Some cosmic changes require centuries. Even in practical terms, sending a spacecraft to the outer solar system requires a mission that lasts longer than the careers of many of the people who begin it. Knowledge becomes a generational act again, but now in a scientific form, rather than in a trade route form. The lifetime boundary reappears not as an obstacle to knowing, but as a boundary that forces institutions and traditions to outlast individuals. This returns the story to an earlier theme in a new setting. In Section 4, Generational Paths show how societies can maintain roots and projects beyond one life. In the astronomical and technological world, the same social solution becomes necessary for dealing with vast distances. If a mission takes decades, then the community must sustain it. If a measurement requires long baselines, then the culture of science must preserve records and methods across generations. Distance greater than a lifetime becomes manageable only through continuity. This continuity is not a romantic idea. It is a practical requirement. The recognition that time is the main cost also changes how humans interpret progress. Faster machines can reduce time for certain distances, but they cannot reduce the time below the limit set by light speed, and they cannot reduce the time for interstellar travel to within a life, unless speeds approach a substantial fraction of light speed. Even then, energy requirements become severe. Therefore, time remains a central constraint. The modern mind begins to accept that some distances will remain greater than a lifetime regardless of incremental improvements. This acceptance can be quiet. It can coexist with ambition. It can simply reflect the reality that scale is not negotiable. In a time-framed universe, distance becomes something that shapes planning horizons. Some projects fit within a career. Some fit within a lifetime. Some fit within the lifespan of institutions. Some exceed even institutional stability. The recognition of these categories changes how societies allocate effort. It changes what kinds of exploration are pursued. It changes what questions are asked. A question that requires waiting centuries may be approached differently from a question that can be answered in a year. The lifetime boundary becomes a practical sorting tool. This section holds the shift from effort to time as the key inward move. Distance becomes duration. Duration becomes comparable to lifespan. The next inward step is to explore how machines extend reach while also revealing limits. Machines can compress sometimes dramatically, but they also make the remaining vast distances stand out. This contrast between technological progress and persistent scale sets the stage for a calm understanding of why some distances are still greater than a human lifetime, even in an age of engines, and why the human relationship to far places becomes increasingly one of knowing without arriving. When time becomes the dominant way to frame distance, machines appear to offer a simple remedy: go faster. Across much of human history, this remedy works within the bounds of Earth. Engines, ships, roads, railways, and later aircraft compress travel time dramatically. They make once remote places part of ordinary life. Yet this very success produces a clearer understanding of limits. Machines do not remove distance. They change which distances matter. They shift the lifetime boundary outward on some scales while leaving it unchanged on others. And they make the remaining vast distances feel even more stark, because the contrast with compressed earthly travel is so large. In this stage, distance greater than a human lifetime becomes both a shrinking category on Earth and a growing category in the sky. Mechanical travel begins by separating speed from muscle. A ship can carry heavy loads farther than any person could carry on foot. A train can move faster than any animal over long distances. An engine can work continuously without fatigue as long as it is supplied with fuel. These facts change the relationship between travel and endurance. Journeys that once required months of walking can be done in days. Supplies can be carried more easily. The body's limits become less central. In many regions, this creates a sense that distance has been defeated. Yet the deeper effect is to reveal that distance is not one thing. There are layers of distance, and the conquest of one layer exposes the next. On Earth, the next layer often becomes communication rather than travel. Telegraph and radio compress information delay, making even distant markets and events feel immediate. When information moves quickly, the practical impact of distance on daily decision-making shrinks. A person can coordinate across continents in real time. In such a world, the lifetime boundary for interaction appears to vanish. Yet this is a local illusion created by high-speed signals and dense infrastructure. It depends on networks' power and maintenance. It also depends on the fact that Earth is small enough in light travel time that the delay across the planet is negligible for most human purposes. This smallness is not a universal condition. It is a property of Earth scale. When machines turn Earth into a small world in terms of time, the solar system becomes the next arena where distance reasserts itself. Spacecraft extend machine travel beyond the atmosphere, but their speeds, while enormous by human standards, are still small compared with the distances involved. A spacecraft can reach the moon in days, but reaching the outer planets takes years. Reaching the boundary of the sun's plasma environment takes decades. In this setting, the lifetime boundary reappears. A mission can outlast a career. It can outlast the engineers who design it. Even when the machine is capable of continuous motion, the scale of the environment makes duration unavoidable. The machine does not eliminate distance. It reveals distance in a pure form because there is no terrain and no detours, only space and time. Machines also reveal the importance of energy. On Earth, fuels can be refilled and routes include resupply points. In space, a craft carries most of what it will ever use aside from the sunlight it may harvest near the sun. For rockets, carrying fuel is itself costly because fuel has mass. This creates a limit on speed that is not simply a matter of building a stronger engine. It is a matter of physics and mass. Therefore, machine speed in space is constrained in a deeper way than machine speed on Earth. The lifetime boundary becomes a function of energy and mass as much as of engineering ambition. The contrast between fast Earth travel and slow deep space travel shapes modern imagination. A person can fly across the world in a day, yet a probe takes years to reach the outer planets. This contrast teaches that the universe is not uniformly accessible. It also teaches that technological progress can coexist with persistent scale. Some distances shrink to triviality. Others remain enormous. The idea that distance can be greater than a lifetime becomes more credible in a world where people experience both extremes. The body can cross Earth in hours, yet machines need decades to approach the sun's boundary. The lifetime boundary becomes a feature of the map again, but at a different scale. Machines also change the meaning of exploration. In earlier eras, to explore is to go there. With modern instruments, to explore can mean to send a machine and receive data. The machine extends the senses. It carries cameras, spectrometers, particle detectors, and radios. It becomes a proxy traveler. This changes how distance interacts with lifetime. A person may never travel to Jupiter, but can see images from a probe within their lifetime. Knowledge arrives without presence. The experience of distance is therefore altered. Distance remains large, but its informational consequences shrink because machines can deliver information faster than humans could travel, even if still slowly. The lifetime boundary for knowledge shifts outward. A person can learn about worlds they will never visit. Yet even informational access has limits. A probe traveling to the outer solar system takes years, so the data arrives late compared with the launch. Mission teams must plan for delays and must maintain funding and attention across long spans. This reintroduces the need for continuity. Machines make distant knowledge possible, but they also demand institutional patience. The lifetime boundary becomes relevant not only for travel, but for planning horizons. A society can fund a project that takes a decade. It may struggle to fund one that takes a century. Therefore, machines extend reach, but the extension is constrained by social timescales as well as physical ones. The starkest revelation of machine limits emerges when the scale shifts from the solar system to the stars. Even the fastest human-made probes travel at speeds that make interstellar distances overwhelming. A nearby star is several light-years away. At current probe speeds, the travel time would be measured in many thousands of years. This is not a boundary that machines have pushed far outward. It is a boundary that remains essentially fixed relative to a human life. Machines have made Earth small and have made the solar system partially accessible, but they have not made the stars accessible in any practical sense. In fact, by making nearby travel feel easy, machines make the star-scale boundary feel more absolute. The mind can see the numbers and feel their meaning. If a spacecraft can travel for decades and still not reach even the sun's boundary quickly, then reaching another star becomes a project of such length that it ceases to fit within the category of human mission planning as ordinarily practiced. This stage also clarifies that the lifetime boundary is not only about how long it takes to arrive, it is about how long it takes to interact. Even if a machine could travel to a star system over centuries, the feedback loop between launch and results would be so slow that the original planners would never see the outcome. This changes what it means to attempt such a project. It makes the project more like a cultural statement than like a scientific experiment in the ordinary sense. Again, the narrative avoids meaning-making, but the structural point remains the time delay forces a redefinition of purpose. A project whose results arrive after many lifetimes must be carried by institutions or by civilizations, not by individuals. Machines, therefore, do not remove the central question of this script. They sharpen it. They show that the lifetime boundary is not an archaic limit tied to walking. It is a fundamental feature of scale. When the environment becomes large enough, even high speed leaves duration beyond a life. When the environment becomes vast enough, even light itself takes years. The lifetime boundary becomes a small ruler held up against a much larger world. This understanding also refines the human relationship to distant places. Some distances are now smaller than a lifetime, by orders of magnitude making travel routine. Other distances remain larger than a lifetime by orders of magnitude making travel implausible. The world becomes divided into regions of routine access, regions of achievable access through machines, and regions of almost pure observational knowledge. This division is not philosophical. It is practical. It is a map of what can be done and what cannot be done within certain timeframes. This section holds the contrast between machine compression and persistent scale as the key inward move. Machines extend reach and simultaneously expose the irreducible vastness of some separations. The next inward step is to focus on planetary distances specifically, because the solar system is where this contrast is most instructive. Planetary travel is close enough to be achieved by machines within decades, yet far enough that it can exceed human lifetimes for certain destinations or mission types. By examining planetary distance in the language of time and mission duration, the script can show how the lifetime boundary becomes a practical feature of exploration, shaping what is attempted and what is deferred. When machines compress Earth's distances, the solar system becomes the first place where distance reasserts itself as a dominant constraint even for technology. Planetary space is close enough to be reached by spacecraft and far enough to demand months, years, and sometimes decades. This middle scale is where the phrase greater than a human lifetime begins to take a modern operational meaning. A mission can be designed, launched, and still not complete its most distant objectives within the career of its designers. A round trip for humans can become infeasible because of time radiation and life support. The solar system becomes a place where the lifetime boundary is not theoretical. It is a practical line in mission planning. The solar system's distances are structured. Inside near Earth, travel times can be days to weeks. The Moon is close enough that mission timelines fit within a short span. Mars, depending on orbital geometry, can be reached in months. The main belt asteroids can be reached in months to years. The giant planets take years. Beyond them, the outer regions of the solar system stretch into decades of travel for current propulsion. The pattern reveals a simple truth: even within one star's system, distance quickly grows beyond what humans can comfortably inhabit. The jump from months to years is manageable for robotic systems. The jump from years to decades begins to press against the practical limits of hardware and institutions. For robotic missions, the lifetime boundary appears first as an engineering lifetime. Electronics degrade, power sources weaken, moving parts wear, radiation accumulates damage, thermal cycles stress materials. In the inner solar system, solar power can support long missions, but in the outer solar system, sunlight becomes too weak for many designs. So missions rely on long-lived power sources that slowly decline. A spacecraft can be built to last decades, but every additional year increases the chance of failure. Therefore, the farther the destination, the more the mission becomes a wager on longevity. This is a form of distance that is greater than a lifetime, in the sense that the vehicle must endure longer than typical technological cycles and often longer than the planning horizon of institutions. The lifetime boundary also appears as a human organizational lifetime. A mission to an outer planet may take a decade or more from conception to arrival. The same scientists who propose the mission may retire before the most valuable data returns. The same engineers who design the systems may not be present to interpret late-life anomalies. The continuity must be carried by teams that change over time. This is a modern version of generational projects. It is not based on oral tradition. It is based on archives, standards, and institutional memory. The solar system forces modern societies to practice continuity again, because distance imposes long timelines. For human travel, the lifetime boundary appears even more sharply, because human bodies require continuous support and are sensitive to radiation isolation and low gravity. A human journey to the Moon can be short enough that many of these issues are manageable with careful design. A human journey to Mars involves months of travel each way, plus time at the destination, making the total duration likely to be years. A journey to the outer planets would require many years or decades, which strains life support, radiation shielding, and psychological endurance. Even if propulsion could be improved, the environment and the need for safety impose limits. In this sense, planetary distances begin to exceed a human lifetime, not only by travel time, but by the cumulative exposure that a long journey imposes. The lifetime boundary becomes a biological boundary as well as a physical one. The concept of round-trip time is central here. One-way robotic missions can accept long durations because a machine can coast. Human missions, especially those framed as exploration rather than as permanent settlement, often require return. Return doubles travel time and adds complexity. If a one-way trip to a destination is measured in many years, A round trip approaches or exceeds a significant fraction of a human life. This is one-way distance becomes greater than a lifetime in practical planning. A destination might be reachable in principle, but not reachable and returnable within a reasonable human span. This changes how humans think about what counts as travel. Travel becomes for distant destinations more like relocation or generational settlement concepts that require social continuity beyond individual lifetimes. Even within robotic exploration, certain missions push against the lifetime boundary in data return. A probe that travels outward to the boundary of the sun's plasma environment may take decades to reach its most scientifically distinctive region. The most interesting data in that sense arrives late. The mission becomes an investment in delayed knowledge. This shifts the psychology of exploration. Exploration is no longer immediate discovery followed by a quick report. It is a long wait followed by a gradual trickle of data. Distance becomes delay. Delay becomes part of the scientific method. The solar system also contains boundaries that are defined not only by distance but by environment. The heliosphere boundary, where the solar wind yields to interstellar space, is a transition that can be reached by a spacecraft over decades. This provides a concrete example of a distance that is greater than many professional lifetimes, and yet still reachable within a human societal lifetime. A person can witness the launch of a probe, and if they live long enough, witness the announcement of its boundary crossing decades later. This is a new kind of temporal experience. It binds a human life to a slow-moving artifact. The artifact becomes a companion timeline. It demonstrates that some distances are larger than a life's active years, but not larger than a life's total span. Beyond the heliosphere boundary lies the deeper interstellar medium, and beyond that, the stars. Here, the lifetime boundary becomes overwhelming again. Even if a spacecraft travels for centuries, it would not approach a star at current speeds. The solar system therefore sits as an intermediate domain where machines can cross many distances within human historical time, but where the next step outward becomes effectively unreachable. This intermediate domain is crucial for understanding the concept of distance greater than a lifetime, because it shows that the boundary is not fixed at one scale. It depends on speed and on the environment. The solar system is where the boundary can be moved by improved propulsion, but not erased. This has a clear effect on what humans choose to do. Missions are prioritized where the scientific return is high relative to travel time. Nearer destinations are explored more thoroughly. Farther destinations are explored with flybys rather than landings, because landings require more mass and more complexity. Some distant bodies remain unvisited, not because they are unknown in principle, but because reaching them would take too long and would require too much for too little return in a human planning horizon. The lifetime boundary becomes a filter shaping exploration choices. The solar system also reveals that distance is not only radial, it is orbital and dynamical. Reaching a planet is not merely traveling a straight-line distance. It is matching orbits, timing launches, and working within energy constraints. A destination might be closer in kilometers at one time and farther at another due to orbital alignment. This makes travel time variable. The lifetime boundary, therefore, depends on windows and on trajectories. A slow mission might take advantage of gravity assists to reach a target that would otherwise be unreachable, but at the cost of longer time. The trade between speed and energy becomes a constant theme. This is another way distance becomes greater than a lifetime, not because the destination is unimaginably far, but because the efficient path is long. This section holds planetary distance as the practical arena where the lifetime boundary becomes a planning tool. The solar system is reachable enough to make delay meaningful, and unreachable enough to make delay decisive. The next inward step is to focus on light as a ruler, because once light years become the standard for describing stellar and galactic distances, the lifetime boundary becomes not only practical, but intrinsic. Light itself takes longer than a lifetime to cross many gaps. At that point, distance becomes greater than a lifetime even for signals, and the universe becomes structured by delays that no technology can eliminate without changing the fundamental limit set by light speed. After planetary distances reveal how time can dominate even machine travel, the next inward layer is where time and distance become formally inseparable, the use of light itself as a ruler. When distance is expressed in light years, the comparison to a human lifetime is built into the language because a light year is defined by 1 year of travel at light speed. This does not make distance easier. It makes distance honest. It states plainly that even the fastest possible signal known to physics requires years to cross many gaps. In this framing, distance greater than a human lifetime becomes not an accident of slow travel, but a structural property of the universe. The idea begins with the recognition that light has a finite speed. For most of human history, light is experienced as instant. The sun rises and the world brightens. A fire is lit and the area is illuminated. Only when careful measurement becomes possible does it become clear that light does not arrive at infinite speed. Once the speed of light is established, it becomes a constant that links space and time. It becomes possible to define a distance by the time light takes to cross it. This is not an arbitrary choice. It is a natural consequence of a universe where signals travel at finite speed. A light year is a large unit in human terms, and it immediately reshapes intuition. It is far larger than the distances within the solar system. Yet it is the right scale for stellar separation. The nearest stars are a few light years away. Many bright stars visible to the unaided eye are tens, hundreds, or more light years away. When these distances are stated, the meaning is direct. Light from a star 100 light years away has been traveling for 100 years. The observer is not seeing the star as it is now in some absolute sense. The observer is seeing the star as it was when the light left. This is the first quiet way the lifetime boundary enters the sky. The light itself carries a duration comparable to or greater than a human life. For many objects, the light travel time is longer than any individual can experience. This changes what it means to observe. Observation becomes a form of looking into the past. For nearby stars, the past is recent in historical terms. For distant galaxies, the past can be millions or billions of years. Yet even in the nearer range, the lifetime comparison matters. A star 50 light years away is seen as it was 50 years ago. Many people live long enough that their birth and the star's observed light might be separated by similar spans. The universe becomes threaded with time delays that can be compared directly to a life. The lifetime boundary also enters communication in a rigorous way. If a message is sent by radio, it travels at light speed. Therefore, a message to a star 10 light-years away takes 10 years to arrive. A reply sent immediately upon receipt would take another 10 years. The earliest possible exchange would therefore take at least 20 years, plus any time needed to respond. This is an exchange that can fit within a human life, but it is slow. At 100 light-years, the earliest possible exchange becomes 2 centuries. At that point, the exchange exceeds a human lifetime by a wide margin. The distance does not only block travel, it blocks conversation. It creates isolation through delay. This isolation is not a matter of technology failing to go fast enough. It is a matter of the limit set by physics. Unless signals can travel faster than light, which is not supported by established physics for information transfer, the delay is unavoidable. Therefore, distance greater than a lifetime becomes a built-in feature of interstellar and intergalactic separation. It does not depend on propulsion choice. It does not depend on road building or ship design. It depends on the structure of space-time and the finite speed at which causal influence can propagate. The use of light years as a ruler also changes how humans imagine the size of the universe. Distances can be stacked. The Milky Way's diameter can be expressed in tens of thousands of light years. The distances to other galaxies can be expressed in millions of light years or more. The scale becomes so large that the lifetime comparison becomes both precise and almost trivial. A human lifetime of decades is a fraction of the light travel time across a galaxy. The number is not only larger than a lifetime, it is larger by factors that make the lifetime feel like a small unit. Yet the lifetime remains relevant because it is the scale of human planning, memory, and experience. Light-year distances force the mind to accept that the universe is not organized around human time. Humans must adapt their understanding to a universe whose delays and histories extend far beyond them. This also affects the meaning of discovery. When a distant object is discovered, it is discovered through old light. In that sense, discovery is always delayed. The object might have changed since the light left. The observer may never know its current state directly. For many objects, the delay is longer than a lifetime, meaning no person can observe both an event and its consequences in real time at a distance. The universe's causal structure means that many events can only be known long after they occur. This is another form of distance exceeding a lifetime, not in travel, but in the timing of knowledge. The light-year ruler also clarifies the limits of human physical travel. A spacecraft traveling at a small fraction of light speed would still require many years to reach even the nearest stars. If it traveled at 1/10 of light speed, a nearby star a few light-years away would still require decades. That already approaches the span of a human life for a one-way trip, and a round trip would exceed it. If the speed is slower as current probes are far slower, the travel time grows to many thousands of years. The lifetime boundary becomes a clear dividing line between what could be a mission within a life and what would become a mission across many lives. The use of light years, therefore, turns the question of distance into a question's proportionality. A human life becomes a certain number of years. A distance in light years becomes the number of years light takes to cross it. The comparison becomes immediate if the number of light years is greater than the number of years in a life, then even light requires longer than a life. Any physical traveler slower than light would require longer still. This makes the concept of unreachable distance transparent. It does not require elaborate explanation. It falls out of the unit. Yet this transparency also supports a new kind of calm acceptance. Once the limits are stated, clearly humans can focus on what can be done within them. Astronomy becomes a science of inference measurement and modeling. It does not require travel to distant stars to learn about them. It requires careful collection of light and careful interpretation. The lifetime boundary in this context becomes less of a wall and more of a condition. It defines which questions can be answered by direct interaction and which must be answered by observation alone. This section holds light as the ruler that formalizes distance and makes the lifetime comparison intrinsic. The next inward step is to explore how knowledge continues even when arrival is impossible. When the universe is structured by distances that exceed lifetimes and by delays that cannot be removed, science develops methods that accept knowing without visiting. In that stage, distance becomes less about frustration and more about methodology. The human relationship to vastness becomes one of measurement patience and careful inference with the lifetime boundary, serving as a practical limit that shapes what kinds of evidence can be gathered and how it can be interpreted. Once light becomes the ruler, distance greater than a human lifetime becomes a normal and unavoidable feature of the universe. The next inward change is not a new measurement, but a new habit of mind, the acceptance that knowledge does not require arrival. When the distances to stars and galaxies are expressed in light years, and when even signals take years or longer to cross them, direct contact becomes impossible for most objects of interest. Yet human curiosity does not stop. Instead, methods evolve that are designed specifically for a universe where the traveler cannot go, and where the observer must learn from what arrives. In this stage, distance becomes a boundary not of knowledge itself, but of the ways knowledge can be gathered. The simplest form of knowing without visiting is cataloging. A star's position can be measured repeatedly. Its brightness can be tracked. Its color can be recorded. Over time, patterns emerge. Some stars vary. Some move relative to others. Some appear in pairs. These observations allow inferences about distance, motion, and physical properties. None of this requires reaching the star. It requires stable instruments, careful records, and comparisons across time. The sky becomes a laboratory where the experiment is observation and the controlled variable is time. Spectroscopy deepens this approach by turning light into a source of material information. When light is spread into its component colors, it reveals lines that correspond to particular atoms and molecules. This allows scientists to identify chemical elements in the sun and in stars. The result is a profound change in the meaning of distance. A star is not just a far light. It is a physical object with a composition that can be inferred from its light. The star becomes known in substance, not only in position. This kind of knowledge would have been impossible in a world that required physical travel to learn what something is made of. The development of spectroscopy therefore marks a major expansion of knowledge beyond the reach of travel. It makes the lifetime boundary less relevant to understanding even as it remains absolute for physical contact. Other methods follow. The distance ladder in astronomy is built as a sequence of overlapping techniques. Nearby distances can be measured by parallax. More distant objects can be measured using standard candles, objects whose intrinsic brightness can be inferred from other properties, allowing distance to be estimated from apparent brightness. Galaxies can be mapped in 3 dimensions in this way. The expansion of the universe can be inferred from redshift, the stretching of light's wavelength as space expands. In each case, the method depends on light and on interpretation. Distance greater than a lifetime becomes a routine input to reasoning rather than an obstacle. The universe becomes knowable in structure even when it is unreachable in travel. This does not mean that distance loses its effect. It changes the nature of certainty. Some properties can be inferred with high confidence. Others remain uncertain because they depend on models and assumptions. Yet this is not a weakness unique to astronomy. It is a general feature of science when direct manipulation is impossible. The key point is that humans develop a disciplined way of handling such uncertainty. They state what is known, what is inferred, and what remains uncertain. They refine models as new observations arrive. The lifetime boundary becomes part of the context. Observations may require long baselines, and certain changes may never be observed within a human life. Yet the methods are designed to produce reliable knowledge anyway, by pooling observations across generations. The acceptance of knowing without visiting also reshapes exploration on smaller scales. Even within the solar system, many places are reached first by telescopes and then by spacecraft. Before a probe arrives, a planet or moon is studied by light and by radio. Models are built. Expectations are formed. When the probe arrives, it tests those expectations. In this way, even travel-enabled exploration relies on remote knowledge first. The lifetime boundary remains relevant for some missions, but the methodology of remote inference is already embedded in the practice. The universe trains humanity in remote knowing, and that training feeds back into how nearer exploration is conducted. Another aspect of knowing without visiting is the emergence of a careful distinction between observation time and event time. Because light takes time to travel, an observed event may have happened long before the observation. This matters for interpreting the universe's history. It also matters for how humans think about causality. An observer cannot influence a distant event in real time, and the event cannot influence the observer beyond what its light carries. This separation forces a new kind of humility in thinking about the universe. Yet it also provides a powerful tool. By looking far away, one looks back in time. Astronomical distance becomes a time machine in the observational sense. This is not a metaphorical claim. It is a direct consequence of light travel time. The lifetime boundary becomes less relevant to the range of time that can be studied, because the universe itself provides access to deep time through distant light. Still, the lifetime boundary returns in the human process of building and maintaining knowledge. Instruments must be built and improved. Observatories must be funded and operated. Data must be stored and interpreted. Long-term surveys must be continued. This requires institutional continuity. A sky survey begun in one decade may be completed in another. A space telescope may take decades from proposal to launch. A program to measure subtle changes may require repeated observations over many years. In this way, distance greater than a lifetime imposes its own demands on society. It requires that knowledge-making be generational. It requires that records be preserved and that methods be taught. It requires that people work on projects whose full outcomes they may not personally witness. The same is true for deep space probes. A probe traveling outward for decades is a scientific instrument operating on a timescale that can exceed a career. The scientists who begin the mission may hand it over to others. The probe becomes a moving archive of engineering decisions made long ago. Its signals arriving hours later from the outer darkness are a reminder that distance imposes delay even in the solar system. Yet the probe also demonstrates the power of remote knowing. It carries instruments to places humans cannot go and returns measurements that change understanding. This is knowing without visiting in its most literal form, visiting by proxy. The practice of knowing without visiting also shapes what humans consider meaningful progress. Progress is not only reaching farther. It is extracting more information from the same light building, better detectors, reducing noise, increasing resolution, and improving models. Distance becomes less of a barrier when the information content per photon increases. This is a quiet technological pathway that complements propulsion. It acknowledges that many distances will remain larger than a lifetime for travel, and therefore emphasizes better inference rather than faster ships. This emphasis is not resignation. It is adaptation to a universe with fixed signal speed. In this stage, distance greater than a lifetime becomes integrated into worldview. It becomes a background condition for science communication and imagination. Humans can accept that they will never travel to most of what they study and still pursue understanding. The universe becomes an object of patient inquiry rather than of conquest. Again, meaning-making is avoided, but the structure is clear method replaces motion as the primary way of bridging vast separations. This section holds the methodological acceptance of knowing without visiting as the central inward change. The next inward step is to consider generational projects explicitly in the modern sense, where exploration and science become endeavors begun by one cohort and completed by another. Distance greater than a lifetime once it is accepted as normal forces societies to build institutions that can hold long plans. It also forces a rethinking of what it means to finish, because in a vast universe, many projects may never truly finish. They may only extend with each generation, adding a layer of knowledge without expecting a final arrival. When knowing without visiting becomes normal, distance greater than a human lifetime stops being a surprising fact and becomes a design constraint. The most direct human response to such a constraint is to organize work so that it can continue beyond one life. In earlier eras, this appears as trade routes, oral transmission, and long building projects. In the modern era, it appears as institutions of science, long-term engineering programs, archives, standards, and intergenerational teams. In this stage, distance becomes an organizing principle for civilization's projects. It shapes how exploration is planned, how knowledge is stored, and how success is defined when no single person can see the beginning and the end. Long projects begin in astronomy with surveys and observatories that operate for decades. A telescope is built with the intention that it will gather data year after year. Its data is processed and stored sometimes in forms that outlast the software and the people who wrote it. The value of the project comes not from a single observation, but from accumulation. Distance greater than a lifetime is present here in two ways. First, the objects being studied are so distant that travel is impossible, so knowledge must be built through years of observation. Second, the project itself may require more time than an individual career to fully mature. Some surveys only reveal their strongest patterns after many years of data. Some subtle motions require long baselines to detect. The project becomes a multi-cohort effort by necessity. In space exploration, long projects become even more visible because travel time itself can be decades. A spacecraft sent to the outer solar system can take years to arrive, and then years to complete its primary mission. A spacecraft sent outward toward the boundary of the Sun's plasma environment takes decades to reach the most diagnostic region. Over that time, mission teams change. Expertise is handed down. Documentation becomes essential. The mission becomes a thread that runs through human lives. The spacecraft moving steadily outward becomes a physical embodiment of delayed results. It forces a culture of continuity. Without such a culture, the mission cannot be fully realized, because interpreting late-stage data requires institutional memory of early-stage design choices and calibration decisions. The same logic applies to large engineering programs on Earth that support distant exploration. Communication networks, tracking stations, and data archives must be maintained for decades. Standards must be stable enough that a signal from a spacecraft launched long ago can still be understood today. Personnel must be trained to operate systems they did not build. This is a form of generational continuity that arises specifically because distance produces delay. When a spacecraft is far away, its signal is weak and precious. Losing the ability to receive and interpret it would waste decades of travel time. The distance, therefore, demands that the receiving civilization remain coherent over long spans. In this stage, distance also changes the meaning of planning. In many human activities, planning can assume short feedback loops. A decision produces a result quickly. In deep space and in long-term astronomy, feedback can be slow. A spacecraft's design is tested in Earth orbit, but the true test may come years later in a distant environment. A telescope may be built and then spend years collecting data before certain questions can be answered. This slow feedback forces a different kind of discipline. It places greater weight on simulation redundancy and error tolerance. It also places greater weight on humility and prediction, because no plan can fully anticipate the conditions of a distant long-duration mission. The lifetime boundary, therefore, influences not only how long a project lasts, but how it is designed from the beginning. Distance greater than a lifetime also shapes how success is defined. In a short project, success can be a completed journey or a resolved question. In a generational project, success may be the delivery of a platform that allows future work. An observatory might be considered successful if it produces a data archive that supports discoveries for decades. A spacecraft might be considered successful if it continues returning data long after its primary mission. A survey might be considered successful if it establishes a baseline that future surveys can extend. These success criteria reflect a world where distance and time prevent simple completion. The project is valuable because it enables continuation. This is not a departure from the earlier themes of human history. It is a modern form of the same adaptation seen in ancient roots and monuments. The key difference is the scale and the precision. Modern projects rely on exact records calibration and reproducibility. They require that measurements taken decades apart can be compared meaningfully. They require that data formats remain interpretable. They require that the rationale for design choices is preserved so that later analysts can understand what the instrument is doing. The lifetime boundary makes preservation a technical necessity rather than a cultural preference. Education becomes part of this system. For a long project to persist, new people must be trained to take over. Training requires curriculum mentorship and documentation. In this way, distance greater than a lifetime shapes not only institutions but individuals. A person may join a mission knowing they will not see its end. They may accept a role that contributes to a long arc rather than to a personal closure. The structure of work adapts to the structure of the universe. Archives become central. In earlier eras, oral tradition carries rote knowledge. In modern science, archives carry instrument calibration, observational records, and analytical methods. The archive becomes a bridge across time. It allows a person decades later to interpret data collected long before they were trained. This is essential for astronomy, where objects are distant and changes can be subtle. It is essential for space missions, where the environment changes with distance and time. The archive is the way a civilization extends its effective lifetime beyond individual lives. It is the method by which distance, which creates delay, is made compatible with human-scale attention spans. The lifetime boundary also encourages the idea of incrementalism. When a destination is too far for a rapid visit, exploration proceeds by steps. In space, this may mean first orbiting, then flying by, then orbiting a target, then landing, then returning samples. Each step may take decades and may be separated by long development cycles. In astronomy, it may mean first cataloging, then measuring distance, then measuring motion, then analyzing spectra, then building models. Each step builds on previous work. No single generation completes the full program. The program advances by accumulation. This is how distance greater than a lifetime becomes manageable by breaking the impossible into sequences that fit within human institutions, even if not within individual lives. At the same time, there are projects whose timescales exceed even the stability of institutions. Interstellar probes aimed at another star at current speeds would take many thousands of years. Maintaining a coherent mission over that time is beyond any known human institution. This creates a threshold even within the realm of generational projects. Some distances are beyond not only individual lifetimes, but beyond the plausible continuity of civilization's current forms. The recognition of this threshold sharpens the meaning of the script's title. Distance becomes greater than a human lifetime in many contexts. But for some distances, it becomes greater than the lifetime of civilizations as currently organized. This does not end curiosity. It changes what can be attempted. It shifts focus toward observation and toward local exploration. It also shifts focus toward improving inference rather than expecting arrival. In this stage, the human relationship to distance becomes stable and layered. There are distances that fit within a day, within a season, within a year, within a career, within a lifetime, and beyond. The beyond category grows dramatically once the sky is measured. It becomes populated by stars and galaxies whose separations are fixed in light years. For these, human response is not travel, but understanding through signals. The generational project becomes the primary vessel for that understanding. This section holds modern generational projects as the inward move that responds to vast distance. The next inward step is to explore distance as permanence, where some separations become effectively eternal on human timescales. This does not mean that knowledge stops. It means that the structure of interaction changes. Some distances can never be crossed in practice, and therefore relationships with those regions of the universe must be built entirely through observation and inference. In that final stage before closure, the script can settle into a calm acceptance of limits, showing how human thought adjusts to a universe where many separations are not problems to solve, but conditions to live within. When projects become generational in response to vast distance, a further realization settles in some distances are not only greater than a human lifetime, but effectively permanent on human timescales. This permanence does not require a philosophical conclusion. It follows from simple relationships between distance speed and the finite propagation of signals. Even if technology improves, there remain separations so large that crossing them would require spans longer than any plausible continuity of human institutions, and interacting across them would be constrained by delays that make exchange slow beyond recognition. In this stage, distance becomes a condition of the universe that cannot be negotiated away. The human response becomes less about overcoming and more about accommodating, measuring, and building reliable knowledge under permanent separation. The concept of permanence begins with interstellar scale. A nearby star is a few light years away. This distance is already large enough that even a signal exchange takes years. For many stars, the distance is tens or hundreds of light years, making exchanges take centuries or more. This means that even if a civilization could send messages, the rhythm of reply would be slower than human lives. A conversation would not be a conversation in the ordinary sense. It would be an archive of statements separated by generations. This is a form of permanence in interaction. The separation is not absolute because a signal can cross, but the time structure makes the relationship effectively detached from human experience. Physical travel makes the permanence more stark. A spacecraft traveling at speeds achievable with known propulsion would take many thousands of years to reach even the nearest stars. At such timescales, the continuity required to maintain a mission is extraordinary. The craft would have to survive for millennia. The launch society would have to preserve knowledge of the mission's purpose and maintain the ability to interpret any returned data if any return is even possible. In practice, such a mission becomes less like a mission and more like an artifact sent into time. The distance is not only beyond a lifetime, it is beyond the practical planning horizon of civilizations as they are currently known. This is the essence of permanence in distance, not that crossing is forbidden by logic, but that crossing is so slow that it becomes detached, from any ordinary human framework. The same permanence appears at galactic and intergalactic scale. The Milky Way is tens of thousands of light-years across. Even light takes tens of thousands of years to travel from one side to the other. Any interaction across the galaxy is therefore slow on human terms. The separation between galaxies is often millions of light-years. Light takes millions of years to cross that gap. This makes the lifetime comparison almost trivial in magnitude, yet still profound in consequence. It means that events in another galaxy as observed now occurred long before any human civilization existed. It means that no signal sent today would arrive there within any human future that can be imagined. These are separations that are permanent for all practical human purposes. Permanence also appears in a more subtle way through cosmic expansion. The universe is not static. On very large scales, space expands. This expansion increases distances between far galaxies over time. The further a galaxy is, the faster it recedes in terms of this expansion. There are horizons in cosmology beyond which signals sent today may never reach. Because the expansion of space can carry regions away faster than the signal can close the gap. The detailed framing depends on cosmological models and on the definitions of horizons, but the key practical implication is that the universe contains regions that are not only far but causally disconnected in the long run. In such cases, permanence is not only a matter of large numbers, it becomes a structural feature of the universe's dynamics. For the human relationship to distance, this reinforces a simple, calm fact. There are parts of the universe that cannot be interacted with in any meaningful two-way sense, not now and not later, regardless of technological persistence. Even closer to home permanence can appear through the fragility of long-lived systems. A deep space probe can travel outward for decades, but its power dwindles. Its instruments fail. Communication becomes harder. The probe may continue physically, but its ability to report ends. Beyond that point, its journey becomes silent. In practical terms, the region it enters becomes permanently unobserved by that craft. This is a smaller-scale example of the same pattern. Physical presence without communication does not create shared knowledge. For humans, permanence is often defined by the limits of observation and exchange. A region that cannot be observed or exchanged with becomes in practice beyond reach, even if a body could pass through it. When permanence is acknowledged, the meaning of distance changes again. Distance is no longer framed as a challenge awaiting a future solution. It is framed as a boundary condition that shapes strategy. The strategy becomes to maximize what can be learned through observation and to choose targets where travel time and signal delay allow meaningful feedback. This is why much of modern astronomy focuses on extracting detailed information from light composition, temperature, motion, magnetic fields, and more. It is also why much of space exploration focuses on the solar system, where travel times and signal delays, though large, remain within decades. The lifetime boundary becomes a practical filter, and permanence becomes a reason to concentrate on what is accessible. This does not reduce the universe, it clarifies it. The universe remains vast. The acceptance of permanence allows the mind to hold vastness without constantly turning it into a problem. It also allows planning to be realistic. If some distances are permanent on human timescales, then attempts to cross them must be evaluated differently from ordinary missions. They become long-duration cultural acts or speculative engineering visions rather than near-term scientific programs. Again, meaning-making is not pursued, but the structural distinction remains a project that cannot return results within any plausible institutional lifespan, belongs to a different category than a project that can. Permanence also reshapes the sense of the human place in time. A human life becomes a short window in which information can be gathered and passed on. The continuity of knowledge depends on records and institutions. The permanent distances ensure that much of the universe will always be known only through ancient light, never through contact. This makes the archive central. The archive becomes the human way of dealing with a universe that is larger than any life. It is the means by which slow accumulation can create understanding even when arrival is impossible. At the same time, permanence is not uniform. Some distances that once exceeded a lifetime have been made manageable by technology on Earth. Therefore, permanence is not claimed casually. It is applied where the constraints are rooted in fundamental limits, finite light speed, enormous spatial scales, and in some contexts, the dynamics of expansion. This careful use of permanence is part of the modern relationship to distance. It avoids exaggeration. It states what is constrained and why. It allows the mind to accept the difference between what might be improved and what cannot be changed without altering the basic structure of known physics. This section holds the calm recognition of permanence as the main inward move. Some separations are effectively eternal on human timescales, shaping what can be attempted and how knowledge is gathered. The next inward step is to bring this into a quiet close where the changed sense of scale becomes part of ordinary thought. The conclusion does not interpret meaning. It simply settles the historical arc. Distance begins as walking effort becomes mapped. Structure becomes measured vastness and finally becomes a set of delays and separations that exceed lifetimes. The final step is to show how humans live with this using continuity inference and patience, and how the lifetime becomes a small but steady reference point against which the universe's larger scales can be calmly understood. When distance is understood as permanent on human timescales, in many contexts, the final inward change is not a new discovery, but a settled sense of scale. This sense of scale is historical. It forms slowly as people move from walking worlds to mapped worlds, from mapped worlds to measured worlds, and from measured worlds to a universe where light itself carries time. The question of when distance becomes greater than a human lifetime is therefore not answered by a single date. It is answered by a gradual transformation in how distance is defined and compared. In the earliest stage, distance is a day's effort, and the lifetime comparison is not yet meaningful. In the final stage, distance is a delay embedded in light years and in cosmic horizons, and the lifetime comparison becomes unavoidable and routine. The history begins with bodies and paths. A person learns the world as a set of reachable places, water sources, hunting grounds, shelter sites, neighboring groups. The unit is the day. Distance is experienced through fatigue and risk. The boundary of the known is the boundary of what can be walked, remembered, and returned from. Even when migration covers great space over years, the movement is not held as a single measured distance. It is life unfolding across landscapes. In that setting, a distance greater than a lifetime exists only as an implicit idea because life itself is not yet treated as a countable span that can be compared to a route's duration. Boundaries then create separation. Seas and deserts hide landmarks and punish errors. Mountains close with snow. The horizon recedes as one moves, suggesting a world larger than sight. The known world becomes a network of safe corridors around hard barriers. Trade objects and stories carry evidence of far places into local life. The world grows in the mind before it grows in the feet. Yet distance remains mostly qualitative. It is far dangerous, uncertain. The lifetime comparison begins to form only when travel becomes scheduled and time is counted more carefully. Long routes make that counting necessary. Caravans, sea voyages, and multi-stage exchanges stretch travel into months and years. Once travel time is expressed in years, it enters the same unit as life stages. A journey that takes several years becomes a major fraction of a life. A journey that might take several decades begins to feel impossible for a person to complete and return from. This is the first clear moment where distance can be said to approach the length of a life in a practical sense. Yet it is still possible for a single traveler in some cases to cross very long routes. The category of greater than a lifetime is present, but not yet dominant. Generational continuity then makes the category real in social form. Routes persist beyond individuals. Knowledge is inherited. Projects begin and end across different lives. Writing strengthens this by preserving directions, maps, and records beyond memory. Mapping makes distance impersonal. It becomes a property of the world rather than a feeling. Once distance is impersonal and time is measured, the lifetime boundary becomes a stable concept. A person can look at a route and say it would take too long to complete. The world becomes known beyond the body's reach through representation. The sky then forces a more dramatic shift. Stars and planets are visible and unreachable. Early measurement gives the moon and sun numeric depth. Parallax and the distance ladder extend depth outward to stars. The finite speed of light binds distance to time, turning the universe into a structure of delays. At that point, distance greater than a lifetime is no longer an edge case. It is the normal condition for most of what is observed in the universe. Many objects are so far that their light has been traveling longer than any person will live. Many separations are such that even a signal exchange would take centuries or more. The lifetime boundary becomes intrinsic to observation. It becomes part of what it means to see. Technology then adds a final refinement. Machines compress many earthly distances and make the planet feel small in time. Spacecraft extend this reach into the solar system, making some interplanetary distances accessible within years and decades. This does not erase the lifetime boundary. It reveals it on new scales. The solar system is large enough that missions can outlast careers. The interstellar gap is large enough that travel at current speeds would require thousands of years. In this context, distance greater than a lifetime becomes a planning fact. It determines which missions can return results within human institutional stability and which cannot. It separates exploratory travel from remote study. The mature response is methodological. Astronomy becomes a science of knowing without arriving. It builds tools that can extract physical properties from light and particles. It builds archives that preserve results across generations. It builds institutions that can support long baselines and long missions. Deep space probes become multi-decade projects, and sky surveys become multi-decade records. The continuity required by distance becomes a feature of knowledge-making itself. In this way, distance greater than a lifetime becomes integrated into practice rather than remaining as a distant thought. The idea of permanence enters where scale and physics impose limits that cannot be negotiated. For intergalactic distances, light takes millions of years. For certain cosmological horizons, two-way interaction may never be possible. For interstellar travel at current speeds, arrival times exceed any plausible continuity of human institutions. These are not claims about what is desired. They are statements about delay speed and scale. They show that the universe is structured such that much of it is separated from humans by time intervals longer than lives. The changed sense of scale once formed becomes quiet background. A person can live in a world where nearby distances are routine, and where cosmic distances are measured and understood without expecting to cross them. The lifetime becomes a small ruler held against a much larger structure. It remains useful as a reference for what can be attempted, what can be monitored, and what can be inherited. The universe remains visible, and knowledge remains possible, but the relationship between humans and distance becomes defined by the acceptance that many separations will always be larger than a life. This is the final inward layer of the topic, not the struggle with distance, but the calm familiarity with its true proportions. The closing calm rests on the simplest thread running through the whole history. Distance begins as a day's walk and becomes step by step a delay carried in signals. A path across a valley becomes a route across regions. A route becomes a network maintained by memory and record. A map makes the network visible at once, showing a world too large for one life to personally exhaust. The sky then enlarges the idea beyond any earthbound route, first as an unreachable canopy, then as measurable depth, then as light years that tie space to time. From there, machines compress some distances and expose others, making the solar system a realm of years and decades, and making the stars a realm of millennia at ordinary travel speeds. In the end, distance greater than a human lifetime is not a rare threshold, but a common condition of the universe expressed most cleanly by the fact that even light takes longer than a life to cross many gaps. Knowledge continues by adapting to this condition through careful observation, durable records, and projects that pass from one cohort to the next. The human lifetime remains the steady reference point, not as a measure of what the universe should allow, but as a measure of what can be experienced directly and what must be learned indirectly. The world of daily travel and the world of cosmic scale coexist, each with its own tempos, and the boundary between them is marked not by a wall but by time.